She walked into her sister's wedding wearing a dress that cost less than the centerpieces, carrying 5 years of survival on her back like a wound that never healed. The chandeliers above her head burned like accusations. The man across the ballroom had eyes that had seen men die, and somehow, impossibly, those eyes found her. Before the night ended, he would offer her a lie so dangerous it would become the only real thing she had ever touched. If you've ever been invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and don't you dare leave before the end. The dress was the wrong color. Avery Calloway knew it the moment she stepped out of the cab and saw the other women moving through the hotel entrance in their champagne silk and ivory chiffon, their heels clicking confidence onto the marble like they were born knowing how to walk into a room. Her dress was cornflower blue, which had seemed appropriate when she bought it 18 months ago for a conference she ultimately couldn't afford to attend. She had ironed it twice that afternoon on her bathroom floor because her ironing board had a broken leg and Emmy kept trying to sit on it. There was still a faint crease at the hip that no amount of pressing had erased. She noticed it now, standing in the cold October wind outside the Chicago Meridian Grand Hotel, and she genuinely considered, getting back in the cab. She didn't. She paid the driver with 2 crumpled 20s and a 5, calculated that she had $63 in her checking account until the 15th, and walked inside. The lobby smelled like money. Not fresh money. Old money. The kind that had been sitting in leather chairs for 3 generations and never once worried about the electric bill. Flower arrangements taller than Avery herself stood in marble urns beside the entrance to the ballroom. White orchids, probably. She didn't know enough about flowers to be certain, but she knew they were expensive, and she knew her mother had selected them, and she knew that her mother had not asked for her opinion about a single element of this wedding. That was fine. That was expected. That was the particular shape of her life in this family. She found her name on the seating chart near the entrance, a small white card in a sea of white cards, handwritten in calligraphy, by someone her mother had paid $200 to do something Avery could have done herself in 20 minutes. Table 14. She located it without assistance and without making eye contact with anyone, which was a skill she had developed over many years and many similar occasions. Table 14 was near the back, positioned beside a service corridor door that opened and closed every few minutes to let waitstaff through, sending small drafts of cold kitchen air across the tablecloth. She was seated between a great uncle with a hearing aid that whistled intermittently and an empty chair that had been assigned to a cousin who had apparently decided not to come. She sat down, placed her small clutch on the table, and looked across the ballroom at her family. Her sister Melissa was spectacular. That was the correct word, and Avery was not being unkind when she used it. Melissa at 24 was genuinely spectacular, the kind of woman who existed in the precise intersection of beautiful and magnetic, who had always known how to move through rooms the way their mother wanted, who had made the choices their mother approved of and had been rewarded accordingly. The wedding dress was cathedral length with a 10-foot train and hand-sewn beading along the bodice, and Melissa wore it the way she wore everything, like it had been designed specifically for her body and her life. She was laughing at something her new husband was saying, her hand on his chest, her head tilted back slightly. She looked genuinely happy. Avery was genuinely happy for her. Both things were true simultaneously, even as the empty chair beside her remained empty, and the kitchen door sent another cold draft across her bare shoulders. She ordered a glass of white wine from a passing waiter and drank half of it before the first course arrived. The trouble with family events, the specific and exhausting trouble, was not the event itself, but the performance required to survive it. Avery had been performing for 5 years, performing stability when she was one unexpected car repair from financial collapse, performing confidence when she walked into school pickup and the other mothers looked at her the way people look at something that made a choice they would never make, performing indifference when her own mother suggested, at Emmy's 4th birthday party, that perhaps Avery should consider whether a more suitable arrangement might be possible, which was the careful language her mother used when she meant, "You made a mistake, that mistake has a name and a face, and I am not sure I have forgiven you for it." Emmy's name was Emma Renee Calloway. She was 5 years and 3 months old. She had her mother's coloring, her father's nose, which Avery had spent years trying not to notice, and she currently had a fever of 100.2 that Avery had checked twice before leaving her with Mrs. Okafor downstairs. low grade. Nothing alarming. She had given her children's acetaminophen at 5 o'clock and told Mrs. Okafor to call her cell if it climbed above 101. Her phone was on silent in her clutch. She checked it now. No missed calls. She was putting it back when someone sat down across from her. Not the missing cousin, not anyone she recognized immediately, and she thought she recognized most of the guests on her side of the room. He sat with the particular economy of movement of someone who had been taught or had learned through experience not to waste motion, pulling his chair in close to the table without scraping it, settling his jacket, charcoal, expensive, fitted in a way that did not look like effort, and reaching for the water glass in a single fluid sequence. Then he looked up at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was slightly longer than normal social convention allowed. He was somewhere north of 35, dark hair cut short on the sides, a jaw that looked like it had absorbed several arguments and survived all of them. His eyes were a particular shade of dark brown that she couldn't quite classify in the chandelier light. Not warm, not cold, something more precise than either. There was a scar, small and pale, above his left eyebrow that had the clean geometry of something surgical rather than accidental. He wasn't handsome the way men in Melissa's wedding party were handsome, which was the handsome of gym memberships and orthodontia and an uncomplicated relationship with their own reflection. He was something else entirely, and she registered this observation, filed it, and looked back at her wine. "You're at the wrong table," she said. "Am I?" It wasn't a question. "This is table 14. "I know." She looked at him again. "Your name is on the card?" He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small white envelope, which he opened with one hand, extracting a place card identical to hers. He set it on the table facing her. D. Moretti. "You're one of Marcus's guests," she said. Marcus Hale, the groom, worked in real estate development, the kind that required connections Avery didn't have and didn't want to understand too deeply. "I am," the man said. He looked past her briefly toward the head table, then back. "You're the sister." "Avery?" She didn't extend her hand. "The other one." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible. "There's a hierarchy. In this family. Always." She drank the rest of her wine. "Melissa is the one up there. I'm the one back here." He looked at her for a moment with an attention that was direct without being aggressive, the way someone looks when they are actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. Then he looked at the table setting and said, "The food here is overpriced." She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale through her nose, which was not graceful, but was genuine. "Do you know that from experience?" "I own 3 restaurants in this city." He said it without inflection. Not a boast, just a fact he was sharing the way someone shares a street address. "The food is fine. The markup is not." "Then why are you here?" Marcus asked me. "We have a business arrangement." He paused. "You?" "My sister is getting married. I wasn't given the option of not attending." He nodded slowly. The great-uncle's hearing aid emitted a brief whistle, and the man across from her didn't react at all, which she found oddly soothing. Most people were unsettled by ambient wrongness. This man appeared to process it and discard it as irrelevant. "Dante," he said. "I'm sorry. My name. Dante Moretti." He said the last name with a particular weight, the way people say names that carry histories. He was watching her the way someone watches when they're accustomed to a name producing a reaction. It didn't produce one. She knew the name the way she knew most things about Marcus's business circle. Peripherally, imprecisely, with the practiced disinterest of someone who had learned that certain categories of men were best approached from a distance. "Nice to meet you," she said. He looked at her for another moment, and she had the strange sensation that she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. The first course arrived. They ate in silence that was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual. Avery was accustomed to silences with men she'd just met filling with the particular tension of expectation. Someone waiting for her to perform interest or accessibility, or whatever the occasion demanded. This silence was different. It had the quality of 2 people eating food and nothing more, which should have been ordinary but felt, in this ballroom, in this context, almost radical. She was cutting into her salad when she heard Brandon's voice. She registered it the way the body registers temperature, involuntarily, below the level of decision. The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the ballroom, carrying that particular timbre of amplified confidence. The voice of a man who had always been listened to and expected to continue being listened to. She did not look. She kept her eyes on her plate and the muscles in her jaw tightened slightly, and she swallowed and kept eating. Dante noticed. She didn't know how she knew he noticed because she wasn't looking at him, but she felt the quality of his attention shift the way air shifts before weather changes. "Someone you know," he said. "Someone I used to." He didn't push. She was grateful. Brandon Pierce had not appeared on the guest list she'd seen when her mother had shown it to her 3 weeks ago. She'd looked specifically, carefully, the way you check for dangers before entering unfamiliar territory. But here he was, apparently invited by Marcus's side without her mother's knowledge, or her mother hadn't thought to tell her, and either possibility was equally plausible and equally infuriating. He looked the same. That was the first thought, and she hated it. 5 years and he looked exactly the same, which was the particular unfairness of men like Brandon, who moved through consequences without accumulating them. He was laughing with someone near the bar, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, the picture of a man who had never once been kept awake at 3 a.m. by the specific fear of inadequacy. She looked back at her wine. "He's coming this way," Dante said. His voice was entirely neutral. An observation without inflection. She felt the information land somewhere below her sternum. She put down her fork. She picked it back up. She thought about the $63 in her checking account and the fact that Emmy's fever was probably nothing, and Mrs. Okafor had her number, and she had survived every single difficult thing in the last 5 years without assistance from anyone in this room. And none of those thoughts were particularly helpful at this specific moment. "Avery." Brandon's voice arrived before she looked up. He was standing at the edge of her table with a glass of something amber and his particular smile, the one that had once made her believe he was someone worth trusting. He looked at her dress and she saw it, that fraction of assessment, that almost invisible recalibration of how much she had failed to become what might have been expected, and she kept her expression level. "Brandon, didn't know you'd be here." He glanced at Dante with the brief curiosity of someone who has just noticed a piece of furniture. "You look—" He paused. "Good. You look good." The pause was doing a great deal of work. "Thank you," she said. He leaned against the back of the empty chair like he'd been invited to do so. "How's, He made a small gesture. "Everything." "Fine." "Emmy, right? She's what, 4 now?" "5. "Right." He nodded. "Must be tough. Doing all that." Another gesture, vague, encompassing the whole architecture of a life he had not chosen to participate in. "On your own." She felt the heat rise in her throat, and she did not let it reach her face. This was a skill, too, one she'd learned later than the others. "We're fine," she said. "I'm sure." He smiled at Dante finally, extending a hand. "Brandon Pierce, I know who you are." Dante's voice was quiet and completely flat, and he did not take Brandon's hand. He was looking at his plate. He cut a small piece of salmon with the methodical precision of someone who found the current conversation insufficient justification to stop eating. And he chewed it, and he set down his fork, and only then did he look up at Brandon with an expression that Avery could not immediately categorize. It was not hostile. It was something more specific than hostile. It was the expression of someone who has already completed a calculation and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. Brandon's hand lowered. "And you are?" he said, with the slight edge of someone recalibrating. "Her husband," Dante said. The word fell into the space between them like something dropped from a significant height. Avery did not move. Her hands were in her lap, and she kept them still, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not look at Dante, and she did not look at Brandon. "I wasn't aware Avery was—" Brandon started. "We're private people," Dante said simply. He reached across the table and touched the back of Avery's hand. A single, brief, deliberate contact, and she felt it travel up her arm and into her collarbone with a voltage that had nothing to do with performance. He withdrew his hand. "Aren't we?" The last 2 words were aimed at her, and they were a question in the plainest possible sense, with an offer underneath them that she was being given exactly 1 second to accept or refuse. She looked at Brandon's face. The particular arrangement of surprise and recalculation and something she recognized underneath everything, as the dawning of a humiliation he absolutely deserved, and she made her decision. "We are," she said. She picked up her wine glass. "We don't talk about it much." Brandon's jaw worked once. He looked at Dante with a different quality of attention now. Not the brief glance reserved for furniture, but the careful study of someone trying to read a situation that has shifted without warning. What he found there apparently settled the question, because he said, "Right, well, congratulations. I'll leave you to—" Another vague gesture, and then he moved away toward the bar with the slightly reduced posture of someone whose evening had not gone according to its original shape. Avery watched him go. The kitchen door opened and closed behind her, sending cold air across the back of her neck. Then she turned to look at the man across the table. He had returned to his salmon. "That was," she started, "unnecessary, perhaps." He lifted his water glass. "Effective, certainly." "You didn't ask me," she said. "I gave you a second to object. That's not the same as asking." He looked at her. "Would you have said yes if I'd asked?" She thought about Brandon's pause before the word good. She thought about the gesture, the vague, dismissive wave that encompassed 5 years of her life. She thought about Emmy at home with Mrs. Okafor and the $63, and the ironing board with the broken leg. "Probably not," she admitted. "Then we're both grateful I didn't ask." He set down his glass. "He'll leave you alone for the rest of the evening, possibly longer." She stared at him. "You don't know that." "I know his type," he said, with the quiet finality of someone who genuinely does. She turned this over for a moment. The ballroom around them continued its orchestrated elegance, the string quartet in the corner shifting into something slower, couples moving toward the dance floor, the chandelier light catching the crystal and throwing small prisms across the walls. She was aware, in a way she hadn't been 20 minutes ago, of how visible this table was from the center of the room. Table 14, which she had filed automatically under marginal, had apparently been assigned to someone important enough that its marginality was a mirage. "Why are you really at table 14?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Marcus and I had a disagreement about placement. He suggested I sit closer to the center. I declined." "Why?" "I prefer to see a room rather than be in the middle of it." She looked at him, the scar above his eyebrow, the stillness that he carried like a permanent condition. "What kind of business are you in exactly?" "Legitimate interests," he said. "Restaurants, real estate, some import distribution." "That's a very broad answer." "It's a broad business." He looked at her directly. "What kind of nurse are you?" She blinked. "How do you know I'm a nurse?" Marcus mentioned it. He thought. He paused. "He described you as his wife's older sister who was a pediatric nurse. He said it the way people mention things they consider sad. The phrasing was precise and it was accurate, and it landed with a small, clean pain she had developed enough scar tissue to absorb. "Pediatric floor at Northwestern Memorial," she said. "4th year." "Do you like it?" No one had asked her that question in a long time. Not her mother, who thought nursing was practical but not ambitious. Not her colleagues, who were all too exhausted to ask each other anything personal. Not any of the few dates she'd managed in the last 5 years, which had uniformly ended before anyone got around to asking about her interior life. The question sat in the air with a guileless directness that she found briefly disorienting. "Yes," she said, because it was true. Whatever else was complicated about her life, that part wasn't. Especially with the kids, there's something about... She stopped. She wasn't accustomed to continuing past the short answer. "Go ahead," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that same quality of actual attention. No performance of interest, just interest. "You see them come in scared," she said, "and you figure out what they need. It's not always medicine. Sometimes it's just someone who stays in the room. Most people want to leave difficult rooms as fast as possible." She set down her fork. "I've never minded the difficult rooms." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't imagine you have." The string quartet finished their piece and segued into something more energetic. Around the room, people were finishing their first course, standing, moving toward each other with the relaxed momentum of people in the middle of a celebration. Her mother caught her eye from across the room, the brief, calculating glance of a woman cataloging information, and Avery watched her recalibrate visibly at the sight of Dante seated across from her. Even at this distance, Even through the crowd, she could read the sequence. Who is that? He appears successful. Why is he sitting with Avery? My mother is staring, Avery said. She's been watching since I sat down, Dante said without turning. That doesn't bother you? People watch me regularly, he said. It stopped being relevant some time ago. She believed this. She believed it completely and without a particular reason she could articulate. There was something about the way he occupied his own stillness. Not arrogance, not the performed ease of men who wanted you to know they were comfortable, but something quieter and less negotiable. Something that had been arrived at rather than constructed. You realize what you've done, she said. Complicated your evening. Replaced one complicated thing with a different complicated thing. He tilted his head slightly. The gesture was small and attentive. Would you prefer I walk it back? I can find Brandon and... No. The word came out faster than she intended. She looked at her plate. No, it's fine. It's just... She exhaled. We've never met. You don't know me. You decided on the basis of a 30-second interaction that I needed... I decided, he said quietly, that a man who hasn't paid child support in 5 years should not be permitted to stand at your table and make you smaller than you are. The rest was logistics. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She looked at him. Marcus told you that too? Marcus tells me things. It's a professional habit of his. He paused. I retain information. You retain that about a woman you'd never met. I retain information about people connected to my business arrangements. You were mentioned. He said it without particular emotion, which somehow made it more rather than less affecting. Avery pressed her thumbnail into her palm under the table, the small, familiar pressure that helped her think. You should know, she said carefully, that I'm not in the habit of accepting things from people I don't know. I know. Or performing roles I haven't agreed to. I understand. Or... She stopped. What exactly are you suggesting we do for the rest of this evening? He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was choosing words with the same precision he applied to everything else. Nothing you're not comfortable with, he said. If you'd like to continue the evening as you were planning, alone, at this table, watching Brandon periodically attempt to reassert himself, I'll finish my meal and we'll part without further engagement. He set his hands on the table, and she noticed them for the first time. Large hands, careful hands, a small scar on the knuckle of his right index finger that matched nothing. Or, he said, you spend this evening as someone who arrived here with someone, which is, apparently, what you needed without knowing you needed it. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. She thought about how her mother was still watching. She thought about Melissa, beautiful and spectacularly happy at the head table, who had everything arranged the way it was supposed to be arranged, and had never once had to explain her choices to anyone. She thought about the cornflower blue dress and the crease at the hip and the $63 in 5 years of difficult rooms. You're a stranger, she said. Yes. This is insane. Probably. If Brandon finds out we're lying, but he won't. There was no bravado in it, just the flat certainty of someone who'd managed far more consequential deceptions than this. She put her wine glass down. She looked at the dance floor. She thought about Emmy at home, burning a low fever, trusting her to come back. She thought about how trust worked, the way you extended it into the dark, and either it held or it didn't, and the only way to know was to extend it. One evening, she said. One evening, he agreed. I'm not playing a besotted wife. I'm playing a woman who's been married long enough to be honest. Something that might have been amusement crossed his features, brief and controlled. That suits me better anyway. She nodded once. She straightened her back, which she did automatically in difficult situations. Then she looked at him with the same directness he'd been using on her all evening. You should know something. Tell me. I have a daughter. I don't hide her. I don't apologize for her. If someone asks, I'll answer honestly. He held her gaze. I know about Emmy, he said. 5 years old. You left her with a neighbor tonight because she has a fever. She went very still. Marcus told you her name. Marcus mentioned her once. I remembered. He said it simply, without explanation, without softening it. I'm not asking you to pretend she doesn't exist. The string quartet played. The chandelier burned. Across the ballroom, her mother had turned back to the head table, apparently satisfied with whatever she'd concluded about the man sitting across from Avery Calloway at table 14. Brandon was at the bar now with his back to both of them. "Okay," Avery said quietly. "Okay," Dante said. And that was how it started. Not with a contract or a handshake or any of the formalities that might have made it seem safer. Just a word across a table in a ballroom that smelled like old money, while thunder worked its way in from the lake, slow and certain, the way all serious things arrive. She didn't know, sitting there with her iron dress and her careful posture and her $63, what that single word was going to cost her. She didn't know about Viktor Sokolov or the warehouse by the docks or the cousin she trusted who had already made a different kind of deal. She didn't know that the stillness in Dante Moretti was not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a man who had built his entire life on the ability to survive. She just knew that Brandon Pierce had looked at her like a footnote in someone else's story, and the man across from her had looked at her like something else entirely, and she was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that 5 years of single parenthood and hospital shifts and performing adequacy in front of people who'd decided she'd failed had carved into her. And tired people, sometimes, make the only decision available to them. They say yes to the first thing that feels, against all evidence, like solid ground. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strangeness she couldn't categorize. They danced twice, once because her mother appeared at their table with the particular brightness of someone who had decided to investigate, and Avery needed the rescue, and once because the string quartet played something slow, and she was 2 glasses of wine into a life that felt, for approximately 3.5 minutes, like it belonged to someone who didn't worry about the electric bill. Dante danced the way he did everything, with minimal motion and complete attention, one hand at her waist with a discipline that felt more like restraint than courtesy. Her mother took 11 minutes to ask who he was. "Dante Moretti," Avery said, and she watched her mother's face perform its private calculations. Brandon watched from across the room for an hour and then found somewhere else to be. This was the victory she had not expected. Not the performance of a better life, but the genuine functional relief of a threat that had simply retreated. It was such a small thing. It was enormous. At 9:15, her phone vibrated in her clutch. She checked it immediately, the reflex of a mother who doesn't turn off her phone even at her sister's wedding. "Mrs. Okafor. Fever is 101.1. She wants you, but she's okay. Drink water given." She was standing immediately. She was reaching for her clutch. Dante, who had been speaking with Marcus's project manager across the table, turned toward her with the same quickness she had, and she realized she had made a sound, a small, involuntary intake, and he was watching her with attention that had shifted from social to something more careful. "Emmy?" she said. He stood. "How high?" 101.1. "It's still low, it's just, go." He said it without hesitation. "I'll have a car out front in 4 minutes." "I have a cab." "In 4 minutes," he said again. Then, more quietly, "Go get your daughter." She looked at him for a second, this stranger with his scar and his restaurants and his flat certainty, and she nodded, and she went. The car was there in 3.5 minutes. Black, anonymous, driven by a man who did not speak, and took the fastest route to her address with a confidence that suggested he'd made this kind of trip before. She texted Mrs. Okafor. She stared out the window at the city passing. The lit windows, the October rain that had started while she was inside, the lake somewhere dark and enormous beyond the buildings. She thought about what Dante had said about difficult rooms. She thought about the way he'd stood when she stood, the immediacy of it, like a reflex. She was still thinking about it when she reached her apartment building and took the elevator to the 4th floor and found Mrs. Okafor in the hallway with a cup of tea and worry in her face. Emmy was in her bed, awake, flushed, her dark hair damp against her pillow, and she held out her arms when she saw her mother and Avery went to her without a word, and gathered her close and felt the small burning heat of her pressed against her neck. "I'm here," Avery said. "I'm here. I'm here." "I was hot," Emmy said. "I know, baby. I know." She pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead. 101.2, her body calculated automatically. "I'm not going anywhere." Emmy was asleep within 20 minutes, her temperature dropping slowly toward reasonable. Avery sat beside the bed for an hour, watching, the adrenaline of the evening settling into its usual residue, exhaustion and clarity, and the particular gratitude of people who love something fragile and get to keep it one more night. She didn't think about Dante Moretti for a long time. When she did, it was late, after midnight, when she was washing the dishes from Emmy's dinner that Mrs. Okafor had left in the sink. She was standing at the kitchen window looking at the wet street below, and she was thinking about the word husband in his mouth, and how completely he had said it, and how completely she had believed it for a fraction of a second before she remembered it was a lie. Her phone buzzed once, an unknown number. A text. "She all right?" She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed, "Fever is down. She's sleeping." She started to add thank you for the car, and then deleted it, and then added it back and sent it before she could reconsider. The response came in under a minute. Good. One word. She stood at the sink with the dishwater cooling around her hands and the rain on the window and the small sleeping weight of her daughter down the hall, and she told herself that the evening was over and the arrangement was complete, and she would probably never see Dante Moretti again. Her phone stayed in her hand. 2 days later, a black car appeared outside her apartment building at 7 in the morning. Not a car service. The same car, she thought, the same driver, sitting at the curb with the engine running. She watched it from her kitchen window while she made Emmy's oatmeal, and she told herself it was a coincidence, and she went to work. And when she came home at 5:30 and walked to her door, she found 2 men standing in the hallway outside her apartment who were not building residents and not her neighbor and not any kind of person she had seen before. They were large, still, watching her with the calibrated attention of professionals. One of them said, in accented English that carried the specific geography of Eastern Europe, "Ms. Calloway, we'd like to ask you some questions about Dante Moretti." She stopped. Her keys were in her hand. Emmy was inside. She could hear the television, the particular audio signature of the cartoon show that Emmy watched between school and dinner. She could hear it clearly, which meant Emmy was only a door's width away from these men. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. The man looked at her for a long, careful moment. Then he reached into his jacket, and she went cold in her chest, and he produced a card, a plain white card with a phone number, and held it out to her. "When you're ready to talk," he said. "We're patient people." She took the card. She put her key in the lock with steady hands and let herself inside and shut and bolted the door, and then she leaned against it in the dark entryway, listening to her own breathing and the cartoon voices coming from the living room, and she thought, what have I walked into? Her phone was in her hand. The unknown number was still in her messages. She typed, "There are men outside my apartment. They asked about you." She sent it. She looked at the bolt on her door. She looked at it for a long time. Then her phone rang. Not a text, a call from the unknown number. And she answered, and Dante's voice came through. "Don't open your door. I'm sending someone now. Pack a bag for you and Emmy. 3 days of things. I'll explain everything when I can." "You'll explain everything now," she said. A pause. Then, "You're right, I will." Another pause, shorter. "Avery, I'm sorry. I didn't think they knew about you yet." Yet. She stood in her dark entryway with her daughter's cartoon voices in the background and the bolt on the door and the business card of a Russian man in her hand, and she understood, with the precise and terrifying clarity of someone who has stepped into a room without knowing its dimensions, that the single evening she had agreed to, one evening, she had said, one evening, had already become something else entirely. The question was not what she had walked into. She already knew. The question was whether she was going to walk through it. She looked down the hallway at her daughter's door. "How long before someone gets here?" she asked. 12 minutes, Dante said. "Okay." She was already moving toward the bedroom. "You have 12 minutes to start talking." 12 minutes. Avery counted them the way she counted everything that mattered, precisely, without comfort, with the specific arithmetic of someone who had learned that time was not a soft thing. She pulled Emmy's backpack from the closet and packed it on autopilot. 2 changes of clothes, the stuffed rabbit with the torn ear that Emmy called Professor Hops, the children's acetaminophen, the asthma inhaler she hadn't needed in 4 months, but that Avery carried the way she carried everything important, close, prepared, refusing to believe in safety she hadn't personally arranged. Emmy was in the living room. The cartoon was still going. Avery stood in the doorway of her own bedroom and looked at it. The single bed she'd moved from a queen when the queen took up too much space after it became just her. The framed photo of Emmy on the nightstand from her 3rd birthday with cake frosting on her chin. The shelf of nursing textbooks she still referenced even after 4 years because she didn't trust herself to stop learning. And she thought, someone knows where I live. Not an abstraction, not a theoretical risk. 2 actual men had stood in her actual hallway and said her name with the patience of people who intended to come back. She packed her own bag in 4 minutes. Dante was still on the phone. She had put him on speaker, propped against the lamp, while her hands moved through the familiar motions of selecting the things that mattered from the things that didn't. He was talking. She was listening and packing and listening. And what he was telling her was this. His name meant something in Chicago that went beyond restaurants and real estate, had always meant something, would always mean something, and the people standing outside her door were representatives of a man named Viktor Sokolov, who operated out of the North Side with the kind of patience and precision that made him considerably more dangerous than men who operated on anger. "How long have they been watching you?" she asked. "Sokolov's people have been watching my operations for 8 months, Dante said. "This is the first time they've moved on someone connected to me." "I'm not connected to you," she said it evenly. "I sat across a table from you for 4 hours." A pause. "They don't make those distinctions." "Then you should have thought about that before you opened your mouth at my table." Another pause, and this one had a different texture. Not defensiveness, but something that she recognized after a moment as the absence of an argument. He had no counter to that because there was no counter to that. "Yes," he said. "I should have." She zipped her bag. She stood in the middle of her bedroom and breathed. What do these men want? Leverage. They want something to use against me in a negotiation that doesn't technically exist yet. And I'm leverage. You became leverage the moment someone told them you existed. He paused. I need to know who told them. I don't know anything about your business. I know that. Someone else made the connection. His voice had that flat quality again, but underneath it now was something she hadn't heard before. A controlled heat. The kind that didn't produce noise but produced decisions. I have some ideas about who. She picked up the phone, took it off speaker, pressed it to her ear. Dante. Yes, Emmy is 5 years old. I know. Whatever this is, whatever you and Sokolov are or aren't doing, she is 5 years old and she has nothing to do with any of it. I know that too. His voice was steady and it was quiet and she believed it, which disturbed her because she had not asked to believe anything about this man. The car is 4 minutes out. My driver will bring you to me. From there, I'll decide from there, she said, when I get there. He didn't push. She was beginning to understand that he didn't push, which was its own kind of information. She went to get Emmy. Her daughter looked up from the cartoon with the mild interest of a child who has not yet learned to read the specific tension that adults carry in their shoulders. Are we going somewhere? For a few days? Avery kept her voice at the temperature of routine. An adventure. Emmy looked at her backpack. She looked at Professor Hops, who was tucked under her arm. Is it a hotel? Something like that. Does it have a pool? I don't know. Emmy considered this with the gravity of 5-year-old priorities. Okay, she said. They were out the door in 90 seconds. Avery did not look back down the hallway. She didn't want to know if the men were still there or had gone or had never been there in the way that seemed possible at 3 a.m. when fear started to negotiate with reason. She took the stairs, not the elevator, because she had always taken the stairs in buildings she didn't fully trust, and she didn't fully trust any building that housed people who knew her name. The black car was at the curb. The driver got out and opened the rear door without being asked, and Emmy climbed in with the particular confidence of a child who has decided an adventure is an adventure, regardless of its cause. Avery followed, pulled the door shut, and sat in the leather-scented dark, while the city moved past the windows, and Emmy asked the driver his name, and he said, in a voice made entirely of minimum necessary words, Thomas. Like the train, Emmy said. Yes, Thomas said. Emmy accepted this and looked out the window. Avery watched the streets. The Meridian Grand was behind them. The lake was to the east, invisible but present, the way permanent things are. They drove north, then west, then into a district of older buildings with renovated facades, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial once and retained the bones of it beneath the glass and copper cladding. Thomas stopped in front of a building that was 40 stories of dark glass, with nothing on its exterior to indicate who lived there or what they were. The lobby had security, not a desk attendant. Actual security, two men in dark suits who nodded at Thomas and stepped aside. The elevator required a key card that Thomas produced from his jacket. The floor he selected was 38. Emmy watched the numbers change. 38 is a big number, she said. It is, Thomas agreed. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse vestibule. No hallway, no shared corridor, just a set of double doors that Thomas opened with a second key and held while Avery walked through with her bags and her daughter. The apartment was large in the way that is difficult to describe without making it sound like an advertisement. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides, Lake Michigan in the distance, the city between, lit at this hour with that particular orange-white grid that Avery always thought looked like a circuit board from above. The furniture was dark and spare and real, not staged, not designed to perform wealth, but to accommodate a life, with the small signs of actual habitation. A jacket over a chair, 2 cups in the drying rack by the kitchen sink, a book face down on the coffee table. Dante was on a call when they walked in. He was standing near the window, his jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and he turned when they entered and held up one finger. 1 minute. And Emmy looked at him with the frank evaluation of a 5-year-old cataloging a new element of the landscape. He ended the call in 40 seconds. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at them. At Emmy first, then at Avery, with a quick inventory that was not intrusive but thorough. "You made it," he said. "You said 12 minutes, Avery said. "It was 11. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Thomas drives efficiently." Emmy stepped forward with Professor Hops. "I'm Emmy," she said. "Mom said this is like a hotel. Does it have a pool?" Dante looked at her for a moment. He looked at her the way some adults look at children, calculating the appropriate register, deciding how much of themselves to offer. Then he crouched, which brought him to eye level, and said, "No pool. But there's a window on the north side that shows the lake, and sometimes at night you can see the lights of the boats." Emmy weighed this against the pool option. "Can we look?" "Tomorrow," Dante said. "It's late." Emmy accepted this with the reasonable practicality of a child whose mother had raised her on honest timelines. She looked at Professor Hops. She looked back at Dante. "Okay," she said. He stood. He looked at Avery with the particular question that didn't need words. "Is that all right?" And she recognized it and gave a single nod that meant yes and also meant, "We are not done talking." Thomas had disappeared somewhere. The apartment was quiet except for the city sound that filtered through the glass at this height, which was different from city sound at street level, smoothed, abstracted, the noise of a place seen from a distance rather than lived inside. Avery put Emmy to bed in the guest room, large, clean, with a window that faced north as advertised. She sat beside her for 10 minutes, which was all Emmy needed. The fever was gone. The adventure had been, from Emmy's perspective, a success. She went back to the main room. Dante was at the kitchen counter with 2 cups. He didn't ask how she took her coffee. He set one in front of the bar stool, and she sat and he put both hands around his own cup and he looked at her. "Who told them about me?" she said. Not a question this time. "I have a name," he said. "I'm not certain yet." "Tell me the name." He was quiet for a moment. "Your cousin, Daniel Reyes." She sat with this. Daniel was her mother's sister's son, 31, and he existed at the periphery of her family life, present at major events, harmless in the way that people who've never been tested are harmless, which is to say potentially not harmless at all. He worked in finance. He knew Marcus Hale. He had been at the wedding. "You're not certain," she said. 70%, Dante said. The contact between Sokolov's network and someone with access to information about Marcus's guest list traces back through 2 intermediaries to a source I'm still working on. Daniel Reyes had the access. He also has a debt with someone who has a debt with someone who works adjacent to Sokolov's organization. "Adjacent," she said flatly. "That's how these things work. Nobody calls Viktor Sokolov directly." She put her hands flat on the counter. The granite was cold. "Why would Daniel—" She stopped. "He barely knows me." It wasn't about you, Dante said. It was about me. You were incidental. He sold information about Marcus's guest list, which included information about my attendance. The detail about you, he paused, was probably included because you were seen with me. I was seen with you for 4 hours. That's enough. He looked at her steadily. Avery, I'm sorry. I want to say that clearly. What happened at that wedding, I made a decision without thinking through its full consequences. That's not something I do often. I should have thought it through. She looked at him. The apology was flat and direct and carried no performance of remorse, just the fact of it, delivered with the same economy he applied to everything. She believed it for the same reason she'd believed the earlier admission, because it didn't ask anything of her in return. What happens now? She said. Now I manage it. He said it the way he said everything consequential, quietly, with the tone of someone to whom I'll manage it was not a bravado statement, but a job description. You and Emmy stay here until the situation with Sokolov is resolved. This building is, he paused, choosing the word, controlled. Thomas and 3 others are on rotation. Nobody comes in or out without my knowledge. I have work. Emmy has school. Both can be arranged. She stared at him. You can't just... Emmy's school can be contacted. I have someone who can explain a family situation requiring temporary absence without raising concerns. Your hospital can receive a medical leave application. I'm not going on medical leave. The edge in her voice was sharp and she didn't pull it back. I have patients. I have kids on my floor who know my face. A 7-year-old who just started a new treatment protocol this week who asks for me specifically when she's scared. I don't disappear from that. Dante looked at her. He was completely still. Then we find a way to get you to work safely, but you don't go alone. I don't need not a shadow, he said. A driver. Someone who takes you and brings you back and sits in the car in the meantime. You won't see them if you don't want to. She breathed through her nose. She thought about the hallway outside her apartment. The 2 men. The patience in the one who had spoken, which had been the most frightening part. Not aggression, but patience. The patience of people who operate on a long timeline. 1 week, she said. Possibly longer. 1 week, and then we reassess. She picked up the coffee cup. And I want to know everything. Not summaries, not selected information. Everything relevant to why my daughter is sleeping in a stranger's apartment at midnight because someone sold my name to a Russian crime boss. Dante looked at her for a long moment. That's a great deal of information. I have good retention. She held his gaze. You said you retain information. So do I. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement this time. Something more considered. All right, he said. He told her. It took most of an hour. He told her about the Moretti operation, not with pride or with the narrative glamour of a man who wanted her to be impressed, but with the flat precision of a briefing. The territories, the hierarchy, the legal architecture that surrounded the illegal architecture, the history of the arrangement with the Chicago system that had kept things functional for 20 years. And then, 8 months ago, Sokolov's arrival from the East Coast, bringing his operation into territory that had been stable for a generation, looking for leverage points the way new players always look for leverage points. She asked questions. They were specific and they were direct, and she could tell by the quality of his pauses that her questions were not what he was accustomed to receiving in these conversations. He answered each one. By 1 in the morning, she knew more about the structure of Chicago's criminal economy than she had ever expected to know. She also knew that Dante Moretti had not chosen this life in the way that word chosen implied agency from a clean starting point. It had been inherited, structured, and by the time he was old enough to understand what it was, it had already been what he was. She didn't excuse it on that basis. She noted it the way she noted clinical information, with precision, without judgment, for the purpose of making accurate decisions. You should sleep, he said. I'm not tired. She was exhausted. There was a difference. The room beside Emmy's is prepared. He looked at his coffee cup. I'll be on the couch if... You're not sleeping on your own couch, she said. I rarely sleep, he said, which was not said for effect. It carried the weariness of a fact that had long since stopped being remarkable. She looked at him across the counter, this man who had crouched down to eye level for her daughter, who had told her the truth for an hour without asking her to find it acceptable, who was now proposing to sleep on a couch in his own apartment because he had put her in a situation she hadn't agreed to and apparently still felt obligated to absorb the inconvenience himself. "There are two sides of a bed," she said. "That's an architectural fact, not an invitation. I'm telling you so you don't injure yourself being noble on a couch." He looked at her. "I have a 7-year-old patient," she said, "who I need to be functional for in approximately 6 hours. That requires horizontal sleep. Take the other side, or don't." A pause. "All right." It was the least romantic arrangement she'd ever made, and it was somehow more intimate than anything she'd managed in 5 years, which told her something about the state of her life that she filed away for examination at a later date. She slept. She didn't expect to, but she did. The specific deep sleep of a body that had been running on fear adrenaline all evening and finally found a container that felt, in some animal part of her nervous system, secure. She woke once at 4 when Emmy called out from the next room. A bad dream, nothing more. And she was up and down the hall and back before the sound had fully resolved, and she lay back in the dark and listened to Dante's breathing, which was steady and quiet and already awake. "She okay?" he asked. "Dream." Avery stared at the ceiling. "She gets them sometimes when her environment changes. I'll have Thomas move the couch from the study into her room tomorrow if she wants." "She doesn't need—" Avery stopped. She thought about Emmy's voice in the dark, the way she'd reached for Professor Hops before she'd fully found her mother's hand. "Maybe. I'll ask her." Silence. Dante. "Yes." "The men outside my apartment. Will they come back?" "Not tonight." A pause. "Sokolov doesn't move without information. He sent them to establish contact, not to take action. He wants to know what I value before he decides how to use it." "And if he decides what he values is me?" The silence this time was longer. "I won't let that happen." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's a promise, which is a different category of thing in my world." A pause. "Promises I keep." She lay in the dark and listened to the city 38 floors below. She thought about the word promise and the particular weight it carried in a man's voice when he said it without softening it. She thought about how she had come to this room by a chain of decisions, each of which had seemed reasonable in the moment, and collectively had led to a place she could not have predicted from any earlier point on the map. This was the nature of threshold moments. They didn't announce themselves. They dressed like ordinary evenings and sat across tables at other people's weddings. She was almost asleep again when her phone lit up. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't recognize that said, "He can't protect you from what's coming. Talk to us before he makes you part of something you can't walk away from." Below it, a photo. She sat up. The photo was of her apartment building's entrance, taken that evening. She could tell by the light, the wet pavement from the rain. The timestamp in the corner said 11:47 p.m. After she'd left, she was already standing, already moving toward the door, when Dante's voice came, quiet and completely awake. "What is it?" She turned on the bedside light and held the phone toward him. He sat up, took it, looked at the screen for a long, still moment, and his face did what she hadn't seen it do before. The stillness calcified into something harder and colder, something that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the opposite of it, contained. He set the phone down on the nightstand with the careful placement of a man deciding not to throw it. "They have someone in the building," he said, quietly. "The photo was taken after we left." "Yes." He was already reaching for his own phone, which means they were inside the building, or watching it closely enough to have a sightline to the entrance. She heard her own voice, steady, which was not what she felt. "That's not patience, Dante. That's surveillance." "I know what it is." He was on his phone now, typing fast. She looked at him. She looked at the light on Emmy's door, which she'd left cracked. She thought about the hallway outside her apartment, and the business card, and the accented English, and the patience, the terrible patient quality of it, and she understood now in a way she hadn't fully understood 4 hours ago that this was not a situation that resolved with a conversation. This was a situation that had a shape, and the shape was not something she could stand outside of. She had been made part of it, by Daniel Reyes, if Dante was right, by her own face in a room with the wrong man, by the complete accident of a cornflower blue dress and a wedding she hadn't wanted to attend, and a stranger who had said one word across a table. Husband. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and breathed through her palms. She heard Dante's voice, low and controlled, on the phone. She heard Emmy shift in the next room. She heard the city below, indifferent and continuous. Then she heard something else, a sound that shouldn't have been there. A small structural sound from the direction of the main room, the particular acoustic signature of weight on a floor that had been quiet for hours. She and Dante both heard it. He was off the phone in one motion, on his feet, and she watched his face complete a transformation she hadn't seen before and hoped she could forget. Every layer of the man she had been talking to disappearing beneath something older and more precise, and completely without the restraint that made him. The sound came again, not a settling creak, not the ambient complaint of an old building adjusting to temperature. This was deliberate weight, a person's weight, redistributed with the specific carefulness of someone trying not to be heard and not entirely succeeding. It came from the direction of the main room, somewhere near the kitchen corridor, and it had the quality of a sound that had already been happening for several seconds before either of them consciously registered it. Dante moved without speaking. He crossed to the nightstand drawer in 2 steps. Smooth, unhurried in a way that was more frightening than urgency, and removed a gun that Avery hadn't known was there and would have objected to knowing about 6 hours ago. Now she simply registered it the way she registered clinical information, present, relevant, requiring adaptation. He looked at her. He pointed at the wall beside the bathroom door. She understood, flat against it, out of the sight line from the hallway. She moved. She kept her breathing shallow and even, the way she breathed through difficult procedures, the way her body had learned to be useful in situations that wanted her to be useless. She heard Dante move into the hallway. She heard nothing for approximately 15 seconds that felt much longer. Then she heard his voice, low and controlled, in Italian, 2 words she didn't understand, and then a different voice, also low, responding. Then silence. Then Dante appeared in the doorway with his gun no longer visible, and a look on his face that she hadn't seen yet. Not the cold precision of the previous minutes, something tighter and less resolved. "Thomas," he said. "What?" It was Thomas. He came in to change the security rotation and didn't use the entry signal. He said it flatly. "We have a protocol. He didn't follow it." She let out a breath against the wall. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular in her chest that she would have called tachycardic in a patient, and was calling adrenaline response in herself because the alternative was sitting down, which she wasn't going to do. "That's okay. That's fine." "It's not fine," Dante said. "He knows the protocol. He's used it for 3 years." He looked at her directly. "But you're safe. Both of you are safe." She nodded. She pushed off the wall. Her legs were working. "I'm going to check Emmy." Emmy was asleep, undisturbed. Professor Hops wedged under her chin and one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress with the complete physical abandon of a child who has not yet learned to sleep defensively. Avery stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her daughter's face, the flush of deep sleep across her cheeks, the small sounds of her breathing, and she thought, this is the only thing that actually matters, and it is currently in an apartment that belongs to a man I met 4 days ago, and the hallway outside my real home has been watched by people who are patient enough to wait. She went back to the main room. Dante was at the kitchen counter on his phone again. Thomas had gone. She sat on the bar stool she'd occupied earlier and put both hands flat on the granite and waited. He finished the call. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." "You've been telling me things all night," she said. "Keep going." He set the phone down. He looked at it for a second, which was the most uncertain she had ever seen him, and the uncertainty lasted approximately that long, 1 second, before his face settled back into its characteristic density. "The intermediary I mentioned, the one connecting Daniel Reyes to Sokolov's network." He paused. "I've confirmed it in the last hour." "And?" "It's not 2 intermediaries," he said. "It's 1. And it's not someone adjacent to my operation." He looked at her. "The information about you, your name, your address, Emmy's school, your work schedule, didn't come from Daniel Reyes looking at a wedding guest list. It came from inside my organization. Someone who has been feeding Sokolov information for at least 3 months sold him a full profile on you within 48 hours of the wedding." She sat with this. Someone in your organization. Yes. Someone who would have had to specifically research me, specifically build a profile. Yes. His voice was level, but there was that heat underneath it again, more present now, burning closer to the surface. Which means it wasn't incidental. You weren't a detail that got swept up in a larger information transfer. Someone made you a target deliberately. The granite was cold under her palms. She pressed them down harder. Why would someone inside your organization want to make me a target? He was quiet. Dante, there are people in my organization, he said carefully, who have an interest in my vulnerabilities, who would benefit from Sokolov having leverage over me. He paused. And who would have noticed, as everyone at that wedding apparently noticed, that I sat with you for 4 hours and left when you left and sent a car to your address? She absorbed this. They think I mean something to you. They're not wrong, he said. Quiet, direct, without the softening of qualification. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked away. Who is it? I have a name, he said. I've had a name since 2 hours ago. I'm working through what to do with it. What does that mean? It means the name is complicated. She looked at him. Tell me. He picked up the phone. He turned it in his hand once. Then he set it down again and looked at her with the expression of someone delivering information they would have chosen not to have. Marco Reyes, he said, Daniel's older brother. He's been with my organization for 9 years. He runs import logistics for our East Side distribution. She stared at him. Daniel's brother? Yes. So it's family. The word came out with a particular edge. Somebody's family decided to sell mine. Avery? Don't. She stood up from the bar stool. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked at the city. The grit of it, the cold orange light, the lake, a dark nothing at the edge of everything. Her throat was doing something tight and controlled, and she was not going to cry in front of this man, not because she was performing composure, but because she was genuinely angry, which was a cleaner emotion and more useful. My cousin, his brother, a family I've known since I was 12 years old. She put one hand on the glass. It was cold. Daniel brought Marcus and my sister together at a charity event 3 years ago. He was the best man. He gave a speech about loyalty. Dante said nothing. He was at the wedding. She turned around. He hugged me at the wedding. He said I looked good. He said Emmy must be getting so big. Her voice was steady. He had already sold her school schedule. The silence was its own kind of evidence. Where is he now? She said. Secured, Dante said. One word. She understood what it meant and didn't ask for the specifics. And Marco, also secured. He paused. I need to talk to them both. I need to understand the full extent of what Sokolov has and what he intends to do with it. Before I can have any productive conversation with Sokolov about terms, I need to know what his hand looks like. He looked at her directly. I want you to be here when I talk to Daniel. She blinked. You want me to? You know him. You'll see things I won't. He paused. And I think he'll be less prepared for you than for me. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Daniel at the wedding, his arm around her shoulders, his mouth saying her name with the ease of someone who had no idea they were standing next to the consequences of what they'd done, or who did know and had simply decided she wasn't the kind of weight that should slow a person down. When? She said. Morning, he said. After Emmy is settled. She nodded once. She looked at the window. Outside, the city went on being enormous and indifferent, and she thought about the shape her life had had 6 days ago, predictable, exhausting, hers, and the shape it had now, which was none of those things, and also, in some way she couldn't yet name, more real than anything she'd touched in years. She didn't sleep again. Morning came in gray and late cold, the October light thin and without warmth. Emmy woke at 7 with the restored energy of a child whose fever had broken and whose environment, while unusual, contained a window showing boat lights, and a man who had left a box of colored pencils and a sketch pad on the kitchen table at some point in the night without explanation. She found them before Avery was fully coffeed and settled in immediately, her legs folded under her on the chair, drawing something that involved considerable purple. Dante watched her from across the counter with an expression Avery couldn't categorize and decided not to. "What are you drawing?" he said. "The lake," Emmy said, without looking up. "But there's a sea monster in it. It's friendly. It eats boats, but only empty ones." "Responsible monster," Dante said. "Somebody has to be," Emmy said. Avery looked at her daughter. She looked at Dante. He was looking at Emmy with that same precise attention he gave everything, but there was something different in it. Something that had no strategy in it, no calibration. He was just watching a small person make a purple sea monster eat an empty boat, and his face, for once, was not managing itself. She looked away. At 9:30, Thomas arrived, and Avery took Emmy to the north window with the sketch pad, while Dante disappeared into the study. At 9:45, a second man arrived with Daniel Reyes. She knew it was Daniel before she saw him, from the sound of his voice in the entry corridor. That particular tenor she associated with Christmas dinners and the kind of family noise that's warm on the surface and complicated underneath. She handed Emmy to Thomas's approximate custody. "Stay here. Show him the sea monster. I'll be back." And she walked down the hall to the study. Daniel was seated. He looked smaller than he had at the wedding. People usually did when the room had removed their options. He was 31, medium build, the kind of face that read as trustworthy in the specific way that people who've learned to use trustworthiness as a tool look trustworthy. Open, slightly earnest, the architecture of someone you'd cash a check for. He looked up when she walked in, and she watched the sequence cross his face. Recognition, then the particular blanch of a man who had decided someone would never be in this particular room. Dante stood near the window. He looked at her once when she entered, then at Daniel, and said nothing. She sat across from Daniel. She looked at him. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. He closed it. She looked at his hands on the table, restless, the fingers of his left hand pressing into the right knuckle in a small, repetitive motion. She recognized it from hospital assessments. Anxiety localized in the extremities, the body doing the work the face was trying not to do. "Emmy's school," she said. "Walk me through it." "Avery, I'm not asking if you did it. I'm asking how." Her voice was the voice she used with colleagues who'd made an error she needed to understand before she could fix it. Not punitive, not emotional, just precise. "Did you look it up, or did someone give it to you to pass on?" He looked at Dante. Dante didn't move. "I passed on the guest list," Daniel said. His voice was trying to find an even surface and not quite reaching it. "That's it. I gave Marco the guest list. I didn't specifically give them anything about Emmy. The guest list had a +1 notation for me with Emmy's name listed as my dependent," Avery said. "I saw the seating chart. My mother's coordinator put every guest's family information on the internal document. So when you gave Marco the guest list, you gave him her name." She looked at him. "And then somebody else looked her up and found her school and her doctor's office and my work schedule." She paused. "Because you made it easy." Daniel's jaw moved. "I didn't know what they would do with it." "What did you think they would do with it?" "I thought it was about Moretti. I thought they just wanted to know who he'd been talking to. Business intelligence. That's how Marco described it. That's what—" He stopped. He rubbed his face with both hands. "I owed money. Marco knew about it and said he could make it go away if I did one thing. One small thing. I didn't know it would—" "One small thing," Avery said. He looked at her. His eyes were doing the work his hands were doing, the involuntary work of a person who is finding out in real time what kind of person they are. "She's 5 years old," Avery said, quietly, without heat. The quiet was worse than heat would have been. "She had a fever. I came home from the wedding early because she had a fever, and you had already sold her to people who were standing in my hallway." She looked at him for a long moment. "How much?" He didn't answer. "How much was it worth?" "14,000, he said, almost inaudible. "I had a debt of—" "I don't need the number of the debt." She stood up. She had gotten what she came for. Not information exactly, but the confirmation of something she needed to be certain of before she could process it and move past it. The confirmation that it had been real, that it had been deliberate, that Daniel Reyes had looked at the weight of her daughter's name and measured it against $14,000 and made a choice that people were capable of making. She walked to the door. "Avery," his voice cracked at the edge. I'm sorry. I didn't know what they... She stopped with her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. The 7-year-old I mentioned, she said, on my floor at Northwestern. New treatment protocol. She's scared every day and she asks for me by name. She paused. I have kept going into that room every shift for 6 weeks because she needs someone in it. Not because it's easy, because she's worth it. She opened the door. You should think about what you chose to be worth. She walked out. The hallway was dim and quiet. She stood in it for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling, and she breathed through her nose, 1 count of 4 in, 4 out, the way she'd learned to decompress between difficult rooms. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. She heard Dante's voice from the study, low and unhurried, continuing the conversation she had left. She heard Daniel's responses, shorter, quieter, the words of a man who had lost the ability to manage his own narrative and was now simply answering questions. She walked back to the main room. Emmy had progressed from the sea monster to a more ambitious composition involving what appeared to be a building with windows on all sides and a small figure in each one. Thomas was sitting across from her with the particular stillness of a man who has been asked to observe and is doing so conscientiously. "Mom," Emmy said without looking up. "What's Dante's last name?" "Moretti," Avery said. "How do you spell it?" She spelled it. Emmy wrote it in careful block letters at the bottom of the drawing, under the building. Then she held it up. "I made his apartment," she said, "with us in the windows. And him. And Thomas." Thomas looked at the drawing. "I'm bigger than the windows," he said. "Artistic choice," Emmy said. Avery sat down. She put her arm around her daughter, and Emmy leaned into her without looking up from her work. The automatic gravitational comfort of a child who has always known exactly where her safe point is in a room. Avery put her chin on top of Emmy's head and closed her eyes for a moment. Dante came out of the study at 11:15. He found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water, looking at the window. He stood on the other side of the island and said nothing for a moment. "Marco is talking," he said. "The full scope of what he gave Sokolov is broader than I thought." She looked at him. "How broad?" "Supply routes, personnel. 3 of my warehouse locations." He paused. "The information has been going across for 6 weeks. Before the wedding. Before you." He said it directly, taking the shape of it himself, not asking her to carry it. "This wasn't opportunistic. Sokolov has been building a case for a strategic move on my operation, and Marco has been the architect." He set both hands on the island. "And I didn't see it." She looked at him. This man who saw everything and had missed this. "What does that mean for the situation with Sokolov?" "It means," Dante said slowly, "that the negotiation I was planning, a face-to-face, controlled, on my terms, is more complicated. He has more leverage than I believed, which means I go in weaker, or..." He stopped. "Or," she said, "or I change the terms of the conversation entirely." He looked at her. "I've been contacted by someone inside Sokolov's organization, a lieutenant. He's willing to provide information about Sokolov's planned timeline in exchange for consideration. If I take that meeting..." He paused. "It carries risk. The meeting point is Sokolov's territory." "Then don't take it." "If I don't, Sokolov moves within the week. On my warehouses, my routes, possibly on the people I have in place." He held her gaze. "Possibly on you. Because Marco confirmed that Sokolov knows about you, knows you're here, and intends to use you in the first conversation with me as a demonstration of his position." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the city moved on its axis, indifferent. "He wants to use me to show you he can," she said. "Yes." She put the water glass down carefully. She thought about what it meant, the specific architecture of being used as a message, not as a person, as a sentence in a conversation between men who had decided she was a useful piece of punctuation. Her jaw tightened, her throat tightened, and underneath both of those, something that had been building since the hallway outside her apartment 2 nights ago. Since the patience in that man's voice, since the photograph with the timestamp, since Daniel Reyes' hands pressing knuckle to knuckle in a gesture of a guilt that had arrived 6 hours too late, that something resolved itself into a clarity she hadn't expected. "I want to be in the room," she said. Dante looked at her. "The meeting with Sokolov. When you talk to him." She looked at him directly. I want to be there. Absolutely not. He wants to use me as leverage. She held his gaze. Then show up with the leverage already in the room. Show up with me present and willing. Change what the leverage means. She paused. You said I wasn't what you expected. This is different. How? These are not people who, Avery, these are people who have used civilians as messages before. In the literal sense, I'm not putting you in that room. You don't put me anywhere, she said. I decide where I go. She put both hands on the island, mirroring him, which she did deliberately. You need the terms of that conversation to shift. I am the thing that shifts them. If I walk in there myself, not as something he took, not as a victim, but as a woman who came on her own terms, that changes his read of the situation completely. It changes his read of you. Dante stared at her. The look on his face was something she hadn't seen. Not calculation, not the controlled assessment of a man weighing options. It was the particular look of someone encountering something they have no existing category for. You've never been in a room like that, he said. I've been in rooms where children were dying and their parents needed someone to be calm, she said. I've been in rooms with people at their absolute worst and their absolute most afraid, and I stayed in them. I don't need it to be comfortable. I need it to be useful. She paused. Is it useful? He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once. Yes, he said very quietly. It would be. Then we plan it. She straightened up. Together. You don't make decisions about my presence without me in the room for those decisions either. That's the terms. He looked at her, and then he said, When did you decide to stop being afraid? I didn't, she said. I decided to be afraid and useful at the same time. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. Then, all right? She nodded. She started to turn, then stopped. Dante. Yes. Thomas. She looked at him. The protocol he didn't follow last night. Was it the first time? He was very still. Why? Because you said he's been with you 3 years and has always followed protocol. And last night he didn't. And the sound he made, I heard it twice before you did. It wasn't someone being careless. She looked at him. It was someone who knew where the floor creaked and moved across it anyway, like he wanted to be heard just enough. She let that sit. Which is either incompetence or a test, and I don't think it was incompetence. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing she'd heard since the phone had lit up with Sokolov's message. Dante's face was doing the thing again. The calcification, the cold, precise stillness beneath which something was burning without oxygen or sound. He picked up his phone from the counter. He looked at it. He set it back down. Thomas has been with me 6 years, he said. I know, she said. I'm sorry. He looked at the phone for another moment. Then he looked up, and she saw it. Not the manager of information, not the controlled man who operated on flat certainty, but a man who had just processed the possibility that the person who had stood outside her bedroom door last night, who had driven them both to safety, who had said a child's name with the right weight, that this person had chosen a different direction, and he had not seen it coming. I need you to take Emmy to the second bedroom, he said quietly. Lock the interior bolt. Don't open it until I come to the door and use these words. He said 2 words in Italian. Can you remember those? Yes, she said. Go now, he said, quickly. She went. She gathered Emmy with the practiced efficiency of a mother who has learned to move a child from point A to point B without triggering alarm. New game, second bedroom, bring the pencils. And she bolted the door and sat on the floor with her back against it, and Emmy on her lap, purple pencil in hand, the sketch pad open to a new page. What are we drawing? Avery said, her voice completely steady. I don't know yet, Emmy said. Sometimes you have to start and then see what it is. Avery put her arm around her daughter and looked at the blank page and thought, yes. Sometimes that's exactly how it works. Outside the door, she heard Dante's voice, measured, quiet, the voice of a man who had built his entire life on knowing who to trust and was now having a conversation with the cost of being wrong about it. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. She knew the shape of the conversation from the sound of it. She pressed her back harder against the door. And then Dante's voice stopped. And there was a silence that had a different quality from all the silences before it, heavier, more deliberate, The silence of a room in which something had just been decided that could not be. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Avery counted them against her daughter's breathing. Emmy still drawing, pencil moving in small, careful strokes across the paper. Her body warm and loose against her mother's chest, with the complete trust of a child who has decided that wherever her mother is where safety lives. 11 seconds of a silence that had weight and texture and the specific density of something irreversible. Then Dante's voice again. 2 words, low and flat. Then nothing. Then footsteps. 1 set, measured, coming toward the bedroom door. The knock was 3 counts. Then his voice, the 2 Italian words he'd given her, and she reached up and drew the bolt, and he opened the door and looked at both of them on the floor. His face was the controlled mask, all the way on, all the way locked. But there was something at his collar, a small smear, dark at the edge, that she recognized from years of clinical work as blood that wasn't his, or was. And she filed the observation and did not ask. "We're moving," he said. 5 minutes. "Thomas," she said. "Handled." He said it in the voice that meant the question was closed. "There's a secondary location. Safer. I should have taken you there initially." He looked at Emmy. "Emmy, we're going on another drive." Emmy looked up from her drawing. She looked at him with the frank assessment of a child calibrating adult faces. "Are you okay?" she asked. Something crossed his face, too fast to name, gone before it resolved. "I'm fine," he said. "You look like you need water," Emmy said. "That's what Mom says when someone looks wrong." "Your mother is usually right," he said. "I'll get water in the car." Emmy accepted this and stood up, gathering her sketchpad with the practical efficiency of a child who has decided to trust a situation. Avery stood beside her and looked at Dante, and he held her gaze for exactly long enough to communicate. "Later, I will tell you. Not now, not in front of her." She nodded. They left in 4 minutes. The secondary location was a brownstone in Wicker Park, 3 stories, indistinguishable from its neighbors, except for the steel core door and the window glass that Avery noticed, when she pressed her palm to it, did not flex. A woman named Carla ran it, 50s, gray-streaked hair, the specific competence of someone who had been doing a difficult job long enough to make it look like nothing. She showed Emmy the kitchen with the directness of someone who knew that children needed orientation and practical information before they needed reassurance. "You like eggs?" Carla asked. "Scrambled," Emmy said. "Good. Only kind I make." Emmy followed her to the kitchen without a backward look. Avery turned to Dante. They were in the front room, low light, the street visible through the treated glass in a slightly distorted way, like looking through water. He was standing near the fireplace that hadn't been used recently, his jacket off, and she could see now. Yes, his own. A cut along the left forearm, not deep, dressed badly with something from what looked like a first aid kit grabbed without much care. She crossed the room. She took his arm without asking permission. The clinical hold, wrist to elbow, and looked at the wound. 3 inches, clean edge, not requiring stitches, but requiring better than what he'd done to it. "Do you have a kit?" she said. "Carla, tell me where it is." He told her. She got it. She sat him down on the fireplace bench and cleaned and dressed the cut with the same hand she used for 7-year-olds and 40-year-olds and every age in between. Steady, efficient, impersonal in the way that isn't cold, but is specifically not personal because the work requires it. He watched her hands. "Thomas," she said, not looking up. "He made a choice," Dante said, quietly. "Was it Sokolov?" "Yes. He'd been turned 4 months ago. The entry last night was a signal, letting Sokolov's people know our exact location, confirming we were there." He paused. "If I hadn't been awake..." "You were awake," she said. "I'm usually awake," he said. Not bravado, just the weariness of a man describing his own condition. She pressed the last piece of tape down. She held his arm for a second, checking the pressure, then let go. She sat back. She looked at him. The scar above his eyebrow, the jaw, the dark eyes with the specific quality she still couldn't name, which she was beginning to think was the look of a man who had been alone with his own intelligence for a very long time. "The meeting with Sokolov," she said. "What changed with Thomas?" "The timeline moved." He looked at the window. "Sokolov knows Marco talked. He knows the information transfer was identified. That removes his advantage of surprise, which means he'll move to consolidate before I can respond. He paused. He's called a meeting. He called it 2 hours ago, through an intermediary. His terms, a warehouse on Halstead, near the docks. Tonight at 10. He wants to present his position directly. He looked at her, which means he's bringing the full weight of what he has. And you. I'll bring mine. He looked at the window. He'll expect me to come with men and money and the architecture of a negotiation, the leverage dance. He paused. What he won't expect is me, she said. Avery, we already discussed this. We discussed a different version of this. What I was imagining was controlled on my terms, with time to prepare. He looked at her directly. This is a warehouse on Halstead at 10 o'clock tonight, with a man who has already demonstrated he is willing to put a child's schedule in a file and call it leverage. The answer is no. She held his gaze. What does he gain if I'm not there? He gains... What does he gain? She said it again, slower, clinical. He gains the ability to define me, to present me as the thing you're afraid of losing, to use the fact of my existence as the sentence that ends your position in this city. She leaned forward slightly. If I walk into that room on my own 2 feet, I remove that sentence. I replace it with something he doesn't have a word for. A woman who isn't afraid of him, who isn't afraid of you. She looked at him. That's not weakness. That's the only leverage you have that he can't prepare for. The fireplace bench was cold beneath her. The room was quiet. In the kitchen, she could hear Emmy asking Carla something about the scrambled eggs. You're a pediatric nurse from Wicker Park, Dante said. Not unkindly, precisely. I'm a woman, she said, who's been managing situations that are bigger than her for 5 years without anyone in her corner. I know how to read a room. I know how to read fear in people who are trying to look like they don't have it. She looked at him. And I know how to stand in a room where someone wants me to flinch and not flinch. He looked at her for a very long time. If anything at all goes wrong, he said, nothing will go wrong. You don't know that. Neither do you, she said. That's the condition of every room we've ever been in. You work with what you have and you stay on your feet. The silence between them was the cleanest silence they'd had. Not tense, not weighted, just the space between two people who have arrived at the same understanding from different directions and are taking a moment to register it before moving forward. All right, he said. The hours between then and 10 o'clock were the particular hours of people who are preparing for something they cannot fully prepare for. Dante spent them on the phone, in the study, building the architecture of a position from the rubble of what Marco had given away. Avery spent them with Emmy. Scrambled eggs, the sketchpad, 3 games of a card game Emmy invented on the spot with rules that shifted to Emmy's advantage and which Avery lost deliberately 4 times and genuinely once. At 7, she put Emmy to bed in the back room with Carla nearby and Professor Hops positioned with his torn ear facing the door because Emmy believed he was better protection that way. She sat beside her daughter's bed until her breathing evened out. She thought, I'm going to come back to this room. She thought it with the same deliberate certainty she gave to clinical decisions. Not a wish, a commitment, because wishes were soft, and she had learned that soft things did not survive contact with the specific hardness of the world. She was coming back. That was a fact she was making from the raw material of her own will, and she had made harder things. She stood up. She put her hand briefly on Emmy's head. Then she walked out. Dante was waiting in the front room in his jacket, which was dark and different from the one he'd worn at the wedding. Less event, more function. He looked at her when she came in, taking in the change she'd made. Her hair down from the ponytail she'd worn all day, her posture differently organized, the set of her jaw that she knew from mirrors and difficult moments communicated something specific. Ready? She said. They drove in silence, Dante and Avery in the back, a man named Gio up front who drove the way Thomas had driven. Fast, clean, without unnecessary word. The streets of the city moved past the windows, and she watched them with the particular attention of someone memorizing a route they intend to take back. The Halstead warehouse sat back from the road behind a chain-link apron, a low industrial building from the previous century with its loading bays facing the dock channel. The kind of building that had been used for everything across its life, and wore the evidence of all of it. Rust at the joints, oil stains on the concrete apron, fluorescent light visible through the high windows that gave the exterior a cold white glow against the October dark. Dante looked at it from the car. He said, without turning, "There will be 8 of his men inside, possibly more." He paused. "They won't touch you without his instruction." "I know," she said. "If he gives that instruction, he won't." She looked at the building. "I won't give him a reason to." He looked at her profile for a moment. She felt it. "Avery?" "Yes." "For what it's worth." He paused. "I see you. I want to say that before we go in. I see exactly what you are." She absorbed this. She thought about invisible women and rooms where people weren't seen, and 5 years of performing adequacy for people who'd already decided she'd failed. She thought about a man crouching to her daughter's eye level at midnight without being asked, about a car that arrived in 3.5 minutes because he'd said 4. "I know," she said, quietly. "I know you do." They got out of the car. The warehouse interior was what she had expected, and worse, in the specific way that real things are always worse than imagined ones. Not the wrongness of surprise, but the wrongness of confirmation. The space was perhaps 100 feet across, with concrete pillars rising to the steel truss ceiling and the fluorescent tubes throwing a flat, uninflected light that robbed everything of shadow and made every face look like a version of itself stripped of ambiguity. 8 men. She counted them from the entrance, placed them in the space, 3 flanking the left wall, 2 near the loading bay doors, 1 at each of the 2 rear exits, and 1 standing directly behind the man in the center of the room. Viktor Sokolov was shorter than she had imagined. This was always the way. Men who occupied enormous space in other people's lives were frequently smaller in their bodies than the room had been told to expect. He was perhaps 5'10", stocky in the particular way of a man who had been physically powerful and had converted it into something more sedentary with age. 60, possibly, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had the specific topography of someone who had spent decades making decisions and not losing sleep about them. He wore a good suit. He looked at Dante when they entered, and then he looked at Avery, and she saw it. The recalibration, the adjustment, the brief internal process of a man encountering something he had not filed in his advanced preparation. She held his gaze. Dante walked forward. She walked with him, not behind, at his left shoulder, and she felt the quality of attention in the room shift as they moved. The 8 men recalculating the geometry of a situation that had acquired a variable they hadn't been briefed on. "Moretti," Sokolov said. His English was accented but precise, the English of a man who had learned it as a tool and used it efficiently. He looked at Avery with a second study. "I expected you alone." "I rarely do what's expected," Dante said. "Who is she?" Dante said nothing. He looked at Sokolov with the flat dark eyes and the complete stillness, and let the silence work the way he let all his silences work, as a pressure system, accumulating. Avery spoke. "I'm the woman you put in a file," she said. Her voice was level and it was clear, and it carried across the concrete floor without effort. "The one with the school schedule and the doctor's appointments?" She looked at Sokolov directly. "I thought you should see what that file looks like in person." Sokolov looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation, adjustment, and underneath both of those, something she recognized from 20 pediatric intakes a month. A person encountering something they hadn't allowed themselves to anticipate and scrambling to absorb it without showing the scramble. "Brave woman," he said. "Carefully. Practical woman," she said. "You built a position around my being a vulnerability. I'm standing in front of you. That changes the position." A beat. One of the men near the wall shifted his weight. She heard it. The subtle redistribution, the tell of people in rooms where the expected narrative has deviated. "You're a nurse," Sokolov said. He said it the way people say occupations when they mean you're nothing, with the inflection that assigns categories and their relative worth. "Yes," she said. "I work with children who are afraid and in pain, and I stay in the room with them when everyone else needs to leave. That's what I do." She held his gaze. "I'm good at difficult rooms." Sokolov looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dante. Something passed between them. The compressed, rapid language of men who negotiate in the currency of information and force. And she felt the fulcrum of the moment, The way a room can hinge on a single sentence if the sentence lands in the right place at the right weight. "You've lost your inside man," Dante said. His voice was calm, conversational. "Marco has given you 6 weeks of information, which I've now audited. I know what you know. I know what you think you can move against." He paused. "You can't." Sokolov said nothing. "The warehouses you have coordinates for are empty, have been since 48 hours ago." He let that settle. "The routes you have are rerouted. The personnel you have names for have been redistributed." A pause. "You called this meeting to present a position. The position you prepared no longer exists." The warehouse was very still. The fluorescent lights hummed their flat note. Somewhere outside, the dock water made small sounds against the pilings. Sokolov looked at Avery again, and she saw it. The thing she'd come here for, the thing she'd told Dante would be worth more than any piece of strategic information. Uncertainty. The specific uncertainty of a man who had constructed a situation with a specific shape and was now inside a different shape and needed a moment to find his edges again. She pressed it. "I want to ask you something," she said. Sokolov's eyes moved to her. "The file you have on me," she said. "Emmy's school is St. Catherine's on Dearborn. Wednesday afternoons she has art. Thursday mornings is music." She looked at him without blinking. "You have that. You paid for it." She paused. "She's 5 years old. She draws sea monsters that eat empty boats. She names stuffed rabbits Professor Hops." She let a breath go. "What exactly did you think you were going to do with that?" The silence was complete. One of the men near the wall had gone completely still. She registered it peripherally. Not a professional stillness, but a personal one. The stillness of a person in the process of a private reaction. Sokolov looked at her for a long time. His face was working through something she couldn't fully read. He said, finally, in a voice that had lost its previous architecture, "You have nerve." "I have a daughter," she said. "It's the same thing." And then the man near the wall moved. Not toward her. Away. One step. A physical expression of something that had no tactical component. He was maybe 45, heavy-set, and his face had rearranged itself around something private and unmanaged. He put his hand on the wall. He looked at the floor. Sokolov glanced at him. Back at Avery. The calculation continued behind his eyes, but it was calculating different variables now. She could see it, the way she saw anxiety localized in extremities, the body doing what the face was trying not to. "Your operation is compromised from the inside," Dante said, bringing the conversation back to its practical spine. "You overextended into territory you don't understand, using tools that turned out to be weaker than you assessed. The strategic play, the rational play, is to reset to the existing boundary and allow both operations to continue functioning." He paused. "Or we spend the next 18 months creating damage on both sides that neither of us recovers from in the way we'd prefer." Sokolov looked at Dante. He looked at Avery. He looked at the man standing against the wall with his hand on the concrete and his eyes on the floor. "I need a moment," Sokolov said. "Take it," Dante said. Sokolov turned and walked toward the rear of the warehouse with 2 of his men. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete in the particular way of large, empty spaces. Every sound doubled, given more weight than it carried naturally. The remaining men stood at their posts. Nobody moved. Dante stepped slightly closer to Avery. Not touching, just proximate. The way people stand when they are confirming for themselves and for anyone watching that they are a unit. She breathed through her nose. In through 4 counts, out through 4. Her heart was doing something loud and persistent behind her sternum that she had not allowed herself to register during the conversation and was registering now with the particular intensity of deferred adrenaline. Her hands were cold. She pressed them against her thighs and held them still. "You were right," Dante said, under his breath. For her only. She didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the rear of the warehouse where Sokolov stood with his back to them, his hand raised to one of his men, a rapid, low conversation happening in Russian that carried the sound but not the content across the space. The man at the wall was looking at her now. She met his gaze. His face was open in the way faces are when they've stopped managing themselves. Raw, specific, carrying something recent and unresolved. She gave him a single small nod. the way she nodded to parents in hospital corridors who needed acknowledgement without conversation. He looked away. Sokolov turned. He walked back across the warehouse floor with a different gait than the one he'd arrived with. Not slower, but differently weighted, as if he had put something down that had been in his hands for a long time and was still adjusting to the absence of it. He stopped 12 feet from Dante. He looked at Avery once more with an expression she could not fully categorize. Not respect, not exactly, but something that had respect as a component. "The boundary," he said. "Unchanged from the arrangement that existed before you moved into the north side," Dante said. "My people who are currently released," Dante said, "when the boundary is agreed." Sokolov was quiet. He looked at the concrete floor. He made the calculation that large men who are used to winning make when they encounter the specific mathematics of a situation they did not construct, the calculation between what was wanted and what is available and what it will cost to refuse the available. "Agreed," he said. The word fell into the warehouse with the weight of its own finality. Dante nodded once. "We'll document it through the usual channels, 48 hours. 48 hours, Sokolov said. He looked at Avery one final time. "Your daughter," he said. "The file." He reached into his jacket and produced a phone. He handed it to one of his men, said something in Russian. The man tapped the screen 4 times and showed Sokolov the result. Sokolov took the phone back and looked at it, and then set it face down on the nearest surface, a packing crate, waist height, its wood dark with age, and walked away from it. "It's deleted," he said. He walked toward the loading bay without looking back. His men followed, one by one, the room emptying with the specific efficiency of people who have completed a task and are ready to be elsewhere. The man from the wall was the last to go. He paused near the door. He looked at Avery for a moment. He said something she couldn't hear. She thought it was in Russian. Then he was gone. The warehouse held just them and the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sound of the dock water. Avery breathed out. It was not the careful clinical exhale she'd been using for the last 2 hours. It was the full release, the one that happens after the crisis has passed, and the body takes back everything it borrowed from itself to get through. The tremor in the hands that she'd suppressed, the pressure behind her eyes, the cold sweat at the back of her neck that she hadn't acknowledged during the conversation, because acknowledging it would have made it real and she couldn't afford real until now. She put one hand on the packing crate. She steadied herself against it. Dante looked at her. He didn't move toward her and he didn't speak, and she was grateful for both, for the space to absorb her own response without being managed through it. He waited while she breathed and steadied and put herself back together in the specific order that required. Then she looked up. "The file," she said. "Is it actually deleted?" "His IT will have copies," Dante said, but he made a gesture in front of his men. "In his world, that has weight. He won't use it." She nodded. She straightened up. She took her hand off the packing crate. "I want to go back to Emmy," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked toward the loading bay door. The night outside was cold and clear. The dock smelled sharp, water and metal, and the particular cold of a city in October that had never pretended to be gentle. The car was where they'd left it. Gio got out and opened the door, and she got in, and Dante got in, and the door closed, and the city closed around them again. She looked at the warehouse receding through the rear window, the white fluorescent glow through the high windows, the rust at the joints. She thought about Sokolov's face when she'd described Emmy drawing sea monsters. She thought about the man at the wall with his hand on the concrete. She thought about the file, and whether anything in this world was ever fully deleted, and whether the 48 hours ahead would hold the shape that Dante believed they would hold. Then her phone lit up in her clutch. Not Dante's contact, not Carla. A number she recognized because she had grown up dialing it from a landline at her parents' house in Naperville, and because it had appeared on her screen at holidays and birthdays, and the 2 or 3 times a year when her mother felt the particular seasonal obligation to perform contact. Brandon Pierce. She stared at the screen. He never called. In 5 years, he had sent exactly 4 text messages, all requesting legal documentation for child support determinations he'd then contested, and he had not called once, not once. She picked up. "Brandon." Her voice was flat. His voice on the other end was the Brandon voice she recognized, but carrying something underneath it that she hadn't heard before. Not the ease of a man confident in his own positioning, but the compressed energy of a man who had spent several days constructing something and was now ready to deploy it. "I know who he is," Brandon said. "Dante Moretti. I know exactly what he is." A pause. "And I have enough to take Emmy from you." The car moved through the October city. The lights of Chicago passed across the windows. And Avery Calloway, who had faced a Russian crime boss in a warehouse on Halstead and had not flinched, felt the floor. She didn't answer him right away. That was the first thing. The silence on her end of the line, while Brandon's breathing filled the space with the particular quality of a man who had prepared a speech and was waiting for the gasp that would tell him it was working. She looked out the car window at the Chicago night, the October streets slick from earlier rain, the orange-white grid of the city moving past like something she was watching from a very great distance. And she breathed through her nose and she thought, "Brandon," she said finally. "I have documentation," he said. The compressed energy in his voice had found its release and was moving fast now, the way water moves when a valve opens. "Moretti's name is in federal databases going back 12 years. Organized crime connections, 2 investigations, a RICO inquiry that got dropped because witnesses—" He paused, letting the implication work. "I have a lawyer. We file Monday. Exposing Emmy to a known criminal is grounds for emergency custody review, and my lawyer believes—" "Brandon." She said it the same way she said things to agitated parents in pediatric intake. Not loud, not sharp, just with the weight of someone who has decided the sentence is complete. "Stop." He stopped. She felt it. The caught breath, the recalibration. She looked at Dante. He was watching the road ahead, not looking at her, giving her the room she needed, but the set of his jaw told her he could hear both sides of the conversation. "Where are you?" she said. "That's not—" "Where are you?" she said again. A pause. "My office, downtown." "Stay there," she said. "I'll come to you." Silence. "You'll—" "Tonight," she said. 1 hour. "You and your lawyer if you want your lawyer, though I'd recommend leaving him out of it until after we've talked." She paused. "Do you understand me?" Another pause, shorter this time. The compressed energy was doing something different now. She heard it deflating slightly, the way pressure systems equalize. He hadn't expected her to come toward him. He'd expected panic, deflection, a frightened woman negotiating from the posture of someone who had something to lose. He'd spent 5 years understanding her as that woman, and the recalibration was audible. "Fine," he said. 1 hour. She ended the call. The car was quiet for a moment. "You don't have to," Dante started. "I know," she said. She turned to look at him. "I want to." He looked at her. In the city light moving through the windows, his face was all shadow and plain, the scar above his eyebrow a pale line in the intermittent dark. He looked at her the way he had in the warehouse, with that full, unmanaged attention, nothing held back for strategy. "The lawyer," he said, "Brandon's claim, has no foundation," she said, "but I want to hear it from him directly. I want to look at him and understand what he thinks he's holding before we decide what to do with it." She turned back to the window. "I've been managed by Brandon Pierce for 5 years. He filed late support, he contested amounts, he sent 4 text messages in 60 months, and every single one was designed to make me feel like the problem." She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. "I'm not going into Monday's calendar without this conversation." Dante was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll come with you." "No." She shook her head. "That's exactly what he wants. Me arriving with you confirms every narrative he's built about this. I go alone." "Avery, tell Gio to drop me on Madison," she said. "I'll take a cab back when I'm done." He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Gio, professionally, found something specific to study in the road ahead. Then Dante said, to the windshield, "Gio, Madison, and Wacker." She looked at him. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "I put you in all of this." "You said one word at a wedding," she said. "I said a different word back. We both made choices." She held his gaze. "I'm not interested in reassigning the ledger at this point." Something in his face shifted. That micro-movement she'd been cataloging across the last 6 days. The thing that happened when something she said reached a place he kept locked. He reached into his jacket and produced a phone, A secondary one, not his primary, a simple brick of a device. He held it out. My direct line is the only number in it, he said. If anything, you'll go down any hesitation at all. You call. She took it. She put it in her clutch beside her own phone and the children's acetaminophen she still carried because some habits were non-negotiable. The car stopped on Madison. She opened the door. Avery, his voice behind her. She looked back. He's going to try to make you small again, Dante said. The way he does, the way he's been doing. He held her gaze. Don't let him. Don't. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about a cornflower blue dress and a crease at the hip, and a wedding she'd arrived at alone, and a table at the back near the service corridor. She thought about how far she was from that table right now. Not in distance, but in the specific interior distance that some weeks produce when they compress more change than years. He can try, she said. She got out of the car. Brandon's office was on the 14th floor of a Michigan Avenue building that had glass on 3 sides and the particular aggressive modernity of spaces designed to communicate success rather than accommodate work. She took the elevator up with her heart doing its persistent, loud thing behind her sternum, and she let it. She didn't try to flatten it or breathe it down. She let it beat hard and she went forward anyway, because that had always been the option. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it be the deciding factor. He was alone. No lawyer, which told her he'd thought about her advice and had decided to hear what she had to say before involving legal counsel. He was standing at the window when she came in, the city behind him, and he turned when she entered and looked at her with the same quality of recalibration she'd heard on the phone. A man encountering a version of someone he thought he understood. She sat down across his desk without being invited. He sat down after. Show me what you have, she said. He opened a folder on his desk. He turned it toward her. She looked at it without touching it. Printed pages, a combination of news articles and what appeared to be private investigator documentation, search results, a printed excerpt from what might have been a federal database, the formatting of which was irregular enough to suggest it had been obtained through channels that were not themselves entirely clean. She read. It took 4 minutes. She turned each page with the same clinical precision she used to turn pages of patient files, taking the information in, placing it accurately, not allowing it to alter her rate of processing. Everything in the folder was true. That was the first thing. Dante Moretti's connections to organized crime were documented, real, the history of them spanning a decade and a half of federal peripheral interest. 2 dropped investigations, one name appearing in the margins of a larger case that had been closed for reasons the documents didn't fully explain. All true. None of it was what Brandon thought it was. That was the second thing. She closed the folder. She pushed it back across the desk. She looked at Brandon. He looked the same as he'd looked at the wedding. The easy architecture of a man whose face had never been asked to carry weight. It didn't choose. And she felt something that was not quite the thing she'd expected to feel. She'd expected anger. She'd expected the particular heat of 5 years of inventory, the accumulated cost of what this man's absence had meant in concrete terms, the night she'd calculated rent against childcare, against food costs, against the gap that his non-payment had left in her operating margin every single month, the nights Emmy had asked questions about fathers with the guileless directness of children who don't know yet that some questions have answers that are too complicated to be honest. She felt something quieter than anger, something more like clarity. She asked me last month, Avery said. Brandon blinked. What? Emmy. She asked me last month why her dad wasn't around. She looked at him directly. I told her that some families are made differently, that she had a mother who was completely in, and that was enough. She paused. I've been telling her that for 2 years. Different versions of it. Brandon's jaw worked. I have 4 years of documented non-payment, she said. My lawyer, who I have had for 18 months because I understood eventually that this would become necessary, has the complete file. Every missed payment, every contested amount, every filing delay. The pattern. She looked at him. Do you know what a judge sees when they look at a pattern like that? Avery, a man who disappeared, she said. Not dramatically, not with a conflict or a reason. Just incrementally, strategically, disappeared. reduced his presence and his financial contribution by calculated degrees until he was functionally absent while maintaining the legal appearance of engagement. She looked at the folder between them. And now, 5 years later, when his ex-wife is connected to someone who has money and power and the specific ability to make Brandon Pierce look like what he is, suddenly there's emergency custody concern. She tilted her head. Does your lawyer know that's the timeline? The silence was long. She's my daughter, he said. And she heard it. Not the strategic voice, not the constructed voice of a man making a play. Something underneath all of that. Something older and less managed that she hadn't expected and didn't know immediately what to do with. Yes, she said carefully. She is. I don't want her in that world, he said. Moretti's world. I don't want her that's not... He stopped. He put his hand on the desk. I know what I've done. I know what the last 5 years looks like. I know what it looks like, and I know what it was. His voice had lost its architecture and was doing something raw and irregular. But Emmy is mine too, and whatever I've failed to be, Brandon, she kept her voice even. Listen to me carefully. He looked at her. You don't get to fail for 5 years and then reappear with a folder when you feel threatened and call it concern, she said. That's not what concern looks like. Concern looks like the 4 a.m. presence. Concern looks like the 4 a.m. when she had a fever of 103 and I drove myself to the ER because there was no one to call. Concern looks like learning the name of her stuffed rabbit and the cartoon she watches on Wednesday afternoons and the specific way she needs to be told a thing is going to be okay before she can believe it. She paused. You don't have any of that. You chose not to have any of that. He said nothing. His hand was flat on the desk and his face had gone through several expressions that were not the expressions she was accustomed to from him. Not the ease, not the light confidence, but something that looked, for the first time in the years she'd known him, like the face of a man sitting inside his own consequences. I'm not going to court, she said. Neither are you, because you know what your lawyer will find when she looks at my documentation, and you know what a judge will determine when the pattern is presented. And you know, I think you've always known, that you have not earned the standing you're trying to claim. She looked at him across the desk. But I want to offer you something instead. He looked up. Emmy doesn't need a legal arrangement, she said. She needs a father, if that's something you're capable of deciding to be. Not because a court ordered it, not because it's strategically useful, but because she is a child who deserves to know her father. Then that conversation is available to you. She paused. Through me. On her terms. Gradually, carefully, in a way that doesn't disrupt what she has. She looked at him. That offer has an expiration. If I hear from your lawyer on Monday, it expires. He looked at the folder. He looked at the window. He looked at his hand on the desk. The man, he said. Moretti, is not your concern, she said. He's around my daughter. He has been around your daughter for less than a week, she said. During which time she drew a picture of his apartment and put everyone in it, including Thomas the driver, because she felt safe enough to name the people in the room. She paused. That's the metric. Safety. Not title. Not the category the person falls into. She stood up. Emmy's safety is the only thing I have ever made decisions around. 5 years of evidence supports that. Brandon looked up at her. Standing, she was aware of the specific shift in geometry. She was no longer someone he was looking down at, across, past. She was simply a woman in a room, looking at a man who had made choices and was now, perhaps for the first time, being asked to look at them directly. The folder, she said. He closed it. He put it in his desk drawer. He closed the drawer. She nodded once. I'll be in touch, she said. When I'm ready. When Emmy's ready. She walked to the door. Avery? His voice was quiet, unguarded in the way it almost never was. She stopped. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it. For the way I... He stopped, started again. I know that doesn't... No, she said. It doesn't. But Emmy might want to hear it someday. She opened the door. Keep it for then. She walked out. The elevator was empty. She stood in it and watched the numbers descend, and she breathed. In through 4 counts, out through 4. And she let the things she'd been carrying for 5 years do what things do when you finally set them down, which is not disappear but rearrange, find a different position in the body, become something that you carry differently rather than something that carries you. She stood on Madison Avenue in the October cold and called Dante. He picked up before the second ring. "Done," she said. A pause. "How are you?" She thought about the question. She looked up at the Chicago sky. Not visible, technically, the light pollution rendering it that specific urban non-color that isn't dark and isn't bright, but is the permanent atmospheric condition of a city that never fully stops. She looked at it for a moment. "I think I'm okay," she said. "Actually, I'll send Gio." "No," she said. "I'll get a cab. I need the 20 minutes. A pause. "All right." "Dante." "Yes." "Emmy's drawings," she said. "The sketch pad. Is it still at the brownstone?" "Yes." "Don't let her throw away the one with the apartment," she said, "with all the people in the windows." A silence that was its own kind of answer. "I won't," he said. She hailed a cab. The brownstone on Wicker Park was quiet when she arrived. Carla was in the kitchen with a book and a cup of tea, and she looked up when Avery came in and performed the specific, efficient assessment of a woman who has learned to read the residue on people's faces, and apparently found something that satisfied her, because she nodded once and went back to her book without comment. Emmy was asleep. Avery stood in the doorway of the back room for a long time, just looking. Her daughter lay in the exact position she always slept. One arm off the edge, Professor Hops at the chin, complete physical surrender to the safety of the horizontal. The nightlight Carla had found somewhere cast a low amber glow across the room, and in it Emmy looked like what she was. 5 years old, whole, unburdened, exactly the thing Avery had built the last 5 years around protecting. She went and sat in the chair beside the bed. She sat there for a long time, not thinking particularly, just being in the room with the thing that mattered. Dante found her there an hour later. She heard him in the hallway, the particular cadence of his footsteps she'd already learned, unhurried, minimal, each one placed with intention. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Emmy. He looked at Avery. She gestured at the edge of the bed, the corner of it near the chair, the way you gesture in a room where a child is sleeping. The small, deliberate motion that means sit quietly. He came and sat, and the old wooden bed frame made one small sound and then settled. They were quiet together for a while. "Brandon," he said, very low. "Won't file," she said. "I don't think." "And if he does?" "Then we deal with it," she said. "We have documentation. You have whatever you have." She looked at Emmy's face. "He's not going to file. He looked at himself tonight and didn't like what he saw. That's not a guarantee, but it's a start." Dante looked at Emmy's drawing on the small table beside the bed, the apartment, the windows, the small figure in each one. He looked at it for a long moment. "The figure in the top right," he said. "Is that me?" "Probably," she said. "You're tallest." He looked at it. Something in his face did the thing she'd stopped trying to name and had started simply accepting. The brief, unguarded opening, the moment when the architecture came down, and the man underneath it was just a man looking at a child's drawing of the room where he lived, seeing himself placed in it with the matter-of-fact permanence that children assign to people they have decided are part of the landscape. "She put me in the window," he said. "She put everyone in a window," Avery said. "It means she thinks you belong in the building." He looked at the drawing for another moment. Then he looked at Avery, and the distance between them on the edge of the bed and the chair was not large, and in the amber night light his face was close enough that she could see the scar above his eyebrow in detail, the exact geography of it, the way it interrupted his expression like a footnote in a longer story. "Avery," he said. "Don't say you're sorry again," she said. "I wasn't going to." He held her gaze. "I was going to say that I'd like to be in the window, if that's—" He paused. The pause was the most uncertain she had ever seen him, which was saying something, because this was a man who kept uncertainty on a very short leash. "If that's a choice that's available." She looked at him. She thought about one evening, she had said. One evening. She thought about how that sentence had been made obsolete within about 48 hours by circumstances neither of them had arranged, and both of them had navigated. She thought about the things you couldn't have predicted from the starting point, the yellow cab and the cornflower dress and the table by the service corridor, and how the shape of where she was now bore no resemblance to any map she'd carried into that ballroom. She thought that was probably not, on balance, a bad thing. "You should know," she said, "that I'm not easy. I know that. I ask direct questions and I expect direct answers, and I don't perform emotions I'm not having, and I have a daughter who names stuffed rabbits and invents card games with shifting rules and will at some point ask you things that require honesty." She looked at him. "Real honesty, not managed honesty." "I understand," he said. "And your world—" She paused. "I'm not naive about your world. I stood in that warehouse tonight. I understand what it is." She held his gaze. "I can't ask you to be something you're not, but I can ask you to be honest with me about what you are, and what changes and what doesn't, and to make decisions that account for the fact that Emmy is in the building." "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. "Yes," she said, as if testing the weight of the word. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment in the amber light of the room where her daughter was sleeping. She looked at the scar and the jaw and the eyes that had found her across a ballroom full of people who were looking everywhere else. She thought about difficult rooms and the people who stay in them. "Okay," she said. It was the same word she'd said across the table at the Meridian Grand, 10 days and an entire geography of experience ago. It had the same quality. Not a leap, not a romantic declaration, just the flat and honest acknowledgement of a decision arrived at through evidence. She had evidence now. More than she'd had at that table. More than she would have believed she could accumulate in 10 days. She believed it. He reached out and put his hand over hers, which was resting on the arm of the chair. Not the deliberate, performative contact from the wedding. The thing he'd done for Brandon's benefit. This was different. This was a man putting his hand over a woman's hand in a dark room because he wanted to, with no audience and no strategy, just the simple fact of wanting contact with the specific person in the chair. She turned her hand over. She let her fingers close around his. They sat like that for a while. Emmy moved in her sleep, a small adjustment, the arm coming back up from the edge of the bed. Professor Hops shifted. She settled and was still again. "She's going to want pancakes in the morning," Avery said. "I know where to get good pancakes," Dante said. "She likes them with the face, blueberry eyes." "I'll call ahead." She looked at him. There was something almost ridiculous about the conversation. This man, who had said 2 words in Italian last night and produced a weapon from a nightstand drawer, now solemnly discussing blueberry eye pancakes. And the ridiculousness of it was the most real thing she'd felt in longer than she could track. Real the way life is when it isn't performing itself. Real the way 2 people in a room together are real when they've stopped managing the impression they make. She was smiling. She noticed it the way you notice something that's been absent long enough that its return requires a moment of registration. He noticed it too. He looked at her face with the full quality of attention he gave to everything, and what she saw in his expression was something she had no name for but recognized. The look of a man who has been in the business of surviving for so long that he has forgotten what it is to want something that has nothing to do with survival, and is remembering now, in a chair beside a sleeping child, with a woman whose dress had a crease in it when he met her, who had stood in a warehouse and not flinched, who had gone alone to a conversation that required courage, and had come back from it whole. "The restaurant," he said. "What restaurant?" "I'd like to take you," he said. "My flagship, when everything is settled, the 2 of you." He paused. "It's not a formal proposal. It's dinner." "I know what dinner is," she said. "I want to be clear," he said, with a seriousness that she understood was not stuffy, but was the particular seriousness of a man who had operated for years in a world where clarity of intention was a survival mechanism, and who was now applying that mechanism to something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with wanting to get it right. "Dante," she said. "Yes." "It's dinner," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He looked at their hands, linked over the arm of the chair. He looked at Emmy's drawing on the small table. He looked at the window, where the October night pressed against the glass, indifferent and cold and enormous, the way the world is when you're looking at it from inside a room that holds the only things that matter. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were never going to be simple, because the shape of the life they were building had complicated foundations and required constant, deliberate care. The situation with Sokolov settled into the agreed boundary, which held because agreements between people who understand consequence tend to hold. Daniel Reyes was a problem that resolved itself in the particular way that cowards resolve, contritely, with a long apology sent through his mother that Avery read once and filed and did not respond to, because some debts were not cleared by paperwork. Marco Moretti, no relation, disappeared from the city, which Avery understood without requiring the details. The men at her apartment building were never there again. She went back to Northwestern Memorial on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the wedding, and the 7-year-old on the 4th floor looked up when she came through the door and said her name with the specific relief of a child who has been waiting for a person they were worried might not come back. Avery sat with her for 20 minutes before the shift began, just talking, and the girl fell asleep mid-sentence the way children do when they have finally felt the thing they needed and their body stops fighting. Emmy went back to St. Catherine's on Dearborn on a Wednesday. She brought a drawing for her teacher, which was the sea monster that ate empty boats, which the teacher pinned to the bulletin board and which stayed there until the end of the school year. The conversation with Brandon was slow, and it was not clean, and it was not resolved by a single meeting. It never was, in Avery's experience, with people who had accumulated the specific damage that 5 years of absence produced. But it was a conversation that was happening, and the word happening was the operative one, because for 5 years it had not been. Emmy met her father for the first time she could consciously remember on a Saturday afternoon in November, in a park on the North Shore with Avery present and Brandon in his least strategic configuration, just a man with no folder and no lawyer, sitting on a bench, watching his daughter examine a puddle with intense scientific interest. It was not a transformation. It was a beginning, which was less satisfying and more honest. The restaurant dinner was on the last Friday of November. Dante's flagship occupied the ground floor of a converted building in River North, the kind of space that had been made rather than designed. Real materials, real history in the bones of it. The kitchen visible through glass at the back, in a way that made the food part of the room rather than something that arrived from elsewhere. Avery wore a different dress. Not blue. Dark green, fitted, the kind she'd looked at in a store window for 3 months before deciding she'd never have occasion to wear it, and then deciding that occasion was a category she was done waiting for. Emmy wore her best dress, which was red with a white collar, and which she had selected herself with the complete authority of a person who does not require external validation of aesthetic decisions. Dante was at the door when they arrived. He was wearing a suit, dark, fitted, the scar above his eyebrow, the jaw, the eyes. And he looked at Avery for a moment with the full quality of it, and then he looked at Emmy. Emmy looked up at him. She had Professor Hops under her arm. "You came," she said. "I live here," he said. "I know," she said. "But people don't always come even when they live somewhere." She looked at Professor Hops and then back at him. "I'm glad you came." He crouched down to her eye level. He looked at her with the same attention he gave everything, full, unmanaged, without condescension or performance. "So am I," he said. Emmy held up Professor Hops. "He wanted to meet the restaurant," she said. "The restaurant is glad to meet him," Dante said. Emmy accepted this and walked through the door with the confidence of someone who has decided a room is safe before confirming it. Avery stood at the entrance for a moment. She looked at Dante, still crouched where he'd been, now standing, looking at her with the expression she had no name for and had stopped trying to name because some things were more accurately held than labeled. "She's extraordinary," he said. "Yes," Avery said. "She is." She walked through the door. The restaurant was warm and lit the way real spaces are lit, not dramatically, not for effect, but with the kind of light that makes people look like themselves. The city was visible through the windows, Chicago doing what Chicago did in late November, gray and cold and enormous, and somehow, from inside this particular room, not indifferent at all, just big, just the backdrop. They sat at a table near the window. Emmy studied the menu with intense concentration and ordered something she couldn't pronounce, and ate it with complete satisfaction. She told the waiter about Professor Hops. She told him about the sea monster. She told him that her mother had a job where she stayed in the room when things were scary, which was the best job, and that Dante had a restaurant which was also good because it had bread. Dante listened to all of it. Avery watched him listen. After dinner, Emmy fell asleep against Avery's shoulder in the car home, the particular boneless sleep of a child who has been fed and held and has decided the world is, provisionally, fine. Her breath was even and warm against Avery's collarbone, and one hand was wrapped loosely around Professor Hops's torn ear, and the city moved past the windows on all sides. Dante looked at them both. "Avery," he said. She looked at him over the top of her daughter's head. "I want to ask you something," he said, properly this time. She looked at him. The city light moved across his face in intervals. Light, dark, light. The way all moving things are revealed, piece by piece, as you pass through the conditions required to see them. "Ask," she said. He looked at her. He looked at Emmy. He looked at their hands. Emmy's small one wrapped around the rabbit. Avery's wrapped around Emmy. And then he looked back at her face with the eyes that had found her across a ballroom full of people who were looking everywhere else. "I'd like to know if—" He stopped. He started again. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not in the apartment. Not as an arrangement. Just—" He paused. "Stay." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the first word she'd said to him across a table. Wrong table. She thought about the word she'd said when he proposed a lie, and she chose to make it real. Okay. She thought about difficult rooms and the people who stayed in them, not because they weren't afraid, but because they'd decided the room was worth it. She looked at the man across from her in the back of a car moving through the November city, who had crouched to her daughter's eye level at midnight and called ahead about blueberry eye pancakes, and stood in a warehouse while she faced a Russian crime boss, and had never once, not once, treated her like a footnote in someone else's story. She looked at him. "We're already staying," she said. The city moved around them, large and cold and lit. The lake somewhere beyond the buildings in the dark, the grid of it visible from any height, spreading in every direction. The particular permanent architecture of a place that has always been here and intends to go on being here, indifferent to the small and enormous things that happen inside it. Inside the car, a woman and a man and a sleeping child moved through it. No performance, no arrangement, no invisible woman, no careful management of distance. Just three people in a room that happened to be moving, on their way to wherever came next. Which was not nothing, which was, in the specific and unromantic and completely honest accounting of what a life can be when you stop waiting for someone to make you visible and start simply being seen, which was everything.